Good morning and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinandiye Bhurida Jana. So this morning we will continue where we left off last time, and that is on June 10th, 1883, just at the top of page 244. So this was a Sunday, and so a number of devotees had come. This was after Sri Ramakrishna. The day begins as it's recorded in the Gospel in the morning. But by this time, where we are now, it's already in the afternoon. After he has finished his lunch, a devotee says, "Sir, please bless us." "Master, God is in all beings, but you must apply to the gas company. It will connect to the storage tank with the pipe in your house." So that's an analogy he often used, and it's a very beautiful analogy that the gas is available, gas is provided, but you have to connect your house to the gas. You can't just sit in a new house and say, "Let there be gas." You have to connect, make a connection. And then once you do that, then you have access to the gas. And so we have to make the connection to God. We do that through prayer, we do it through meditation, through kirtan, devotional singing, through japa, repeating the names of God, etc. But here he says, especially in the next paragraph, he will say, the first sentence of the next paragraph is, but one must pray earnestly. And so he says, one must pray earnestly. It is said that one can realize God by directing to him the combined intensity of three attractions, namely the child's attraction for the mother, the husband's attraction for the chaste wife, and the attraction of worldly possessions for the worldly man. So one must pray earnestly. So it's through prayer that we make the connection to the gas company. That is, through prayer that we make the connection to God. God is there, God is available, God is present, but it's through prayer that we connect to God. So again, that's a beautiful analogy for several reasons. One, because it emphasizes the presence of the reality that we're seeking. It's not that we have to ourselves go and develop a fracking company and get access to the gas and then pipe it and make a distribution company and all of that. No, gas is present. We just have to connect to it. And so God is present. We just have to make the connection. And one of the best ways to make that connection is through prayer. Through prayer, we express the longing of our heart. And that's one of the greatnesses of prayer. Meditation, easily, and for most of us, it becomes a very passive affair. Well, okay, I'm supposed to think of one thing, whether it's the Ishta or a symbol or whatever it is, just supposed to think of one thing. And so it becomes a very mechanical process, and the mind runs away from it easily. But in prayer, prayer is the act of expressing the heart's desire. And so it calls up the longing of the heart. And so by practicing prayer, we gradually develop that longing of the heart. At first, we may not feel much, we may not feel anything, but if we at least come to a conviction in the power of prayer, because we have heard the words of someone like Sri Ramakrishna, that prayer is effective, and we've seen the record of many saints who realized God mainly through prayer, then we begin to pray with what little feeling we have. But the emphasis doesn't even have to be on feeling. It's not that we should artificially stimulate our feelings when we pray. No, don't try to be emotional when you pray. Don't try to weep. Don't try to be overly emotional. Then you'll only stimulate sentimentality, shallow sentimentality, which can lead us astray. What you want to do is to express the whatever longing of your heart you have. And if it's just a tiny bit, then express that. But don't try to generate, don't try to stimulate artificial emotion. So if you realize that you need protection, if you realize that you need guidance, if you realize that you need to feel or to experience God, then let that be what generates your feeling. And so then he says that if we have that combined attraction of the child to its mother, of the husband for a chaste wife, and for a miser for his wealth, if we have combined those three attractions, then we will easily attain to God. So, of course, we don't start off with that. Only someone who is born a saint starts off with that. So the rare cases in history and in mythology of people like St. Francis of Assisi in history in the West, and there are many examples in the East as well, in India. And in mythology, the cases of Prahlad, who from his childhood had the intense longing for Vishnu, such intense longing that it eventually led to the vision of Narasimha, who came to protect him from the violence of his father. The rest of us, we don't start with that type of attraction, but by thinking about God, by praying to God, by thinking that God is near, that is one of the ways to generate that kind of devotion, is to think that God is nearby. God is easy of access if I could just figure it out, if I could just find out how to get the mind directed in the right way. If I think that God is a long ways away and it will take lifetimes to realize God and a lot of hard sadhana and all of that, then the very prospect of the long effort needed will discourage any devotion. But if I think that which is true, that God is right here, God is here all of the time, all I have to do is somehow to brush aside this thin curtain of forgetfulness which is there, that God is easily accessible, then we are encouraged to do what we can, and we begin to feel devotion rising within us. He continues, there are certain signs by which you can know a true devotee of God. His mind becomes quiet as he listens to his teacher's instruction. Just as the poisonous snake is quieted by the music of the charmer, I don't mean the cobra. There is another sign. A real devotee develops the power of assimilating instruction. An image cannot be impressed on bare glass, but only on glass stained with a black solution, as in photography. The black solution is devotion to God. There is a third sign of a true devotee. The true devotee has controlled his senses. He has subdued his lust. The gopis were free from lust. So here he talks about the three signs of a true devotee of God. So again, these are not given to discourage us if we don't feel that we have all three of them, or if we don't feel we have any of the three. It's to let us know that this is the direction we want to go. And when we begin to see these signs in ourselves, then we'll know that we are going in the right direction. So one of them is very beautiful, is the mind becomes quiet as he listens to his teacher's instruction. And that we see. Why is that? Why is it the mind of a true devotee becomes quiet as they're listening to the instructions of their teacher? It's because they know that if my teacher, that is my guru, we're not talking about any and every teacher, but my guru, when my guru is speaking, it's through the guru, the instruction of the guru and the grace of the guru that I will realize God. And so let me take it in. This is what I want. So ordinary people, those who have not yet developed any devotion, they go to a teacher and ask questions. And while the teacher is answering the question, they're only thinking about, well, what could I ask next? They're not even listening to the answer. They're only thinking about the next question that they can ask. So, or they're thinking about all sorts of other things. And as soon as the teacher is finished, then they immediately they blurt out something else completely disconnected, showing that they were thinking of something else entirely. To give an example, not of somebody who is taking spiritual instruction, but it's a parallel situation or an analogy that once someone called me and asked me how to get to the center where I was at that time. I don't even remember where I was, but they were asking how to get to the center. So I said, well, I can give you directions, but from where you are, there's several different turns that you will have to take. So do you have something to write the directions down with? Yes, go ahead and tell me. So I started saying, we'll take freeway such and such, and then get off on this exit, and then turn. And I was halfway through the instructions when suddenly he said, so when do you have classes? I realized he wasn't even listening. I'd asked him, are you taking down the directions? Are you writing it down? And in the middle of the instructions, it wasn't that long. It wasn't that I was going on for 10 minutes. I'd gotten maybe 2 sentences or 3 sentences into the directions. And so again, that's not, he wasn't asking for spiritual direction, but that's the kind of thing that a person who is not sincere that they do. They ask a question about spiritual things, and they're not really interested in the answer. They just wanted to ask a question. So that's one sign by which we can know a true devotee, that the mind becomes quiet as they listen to the teacher's instruction. And he says, just as the poisonous snake is charmed by the charmer, the poisonous snake remains still. Now, I have no idea, and I should have looked in the Bengali to see if that shed any light on this. I don't know if it would or not. I have no idea what Sri Ramakrishna means when he says, I don't mean the cobra. Why does he not mean the cobra? That I don't understand. Obviously, if he said it, and if M recorded it properly, and I'm sure he did, or he wouldn't have put it in, because he meditated deeply on each thing that he wrote in the gospel. There must have been a meaning, but I have no idea what it is. Again, just as the poisonous snake is quieted by the music of the charmer, I don't mean the cobra. So there is another sign. Second sign is a real devotee develops the power of assimilating instruction. That is, they hear the instruction and they figure out how to practice it. So that's a very important sign also. So one is listening attentively. The second is figuring out how to put it into practice. That is assimilation. It's just as when we eat food, it's not enough to eat food to get it into our stomach. Then there has to be digestion and assimilation. That is, the digestive organs have to convert the food into the components that the body can then absorb to use for the building and repair of tissues and for energy. If we don't assimilate food, it just passes right through us without doing any good. And so, instruction also, we have to develop the power to assimilate it. There's an art to learning how to convert an idea into a practice. Now, of course, if a teacher tells us to practice, this is the practice, this is how you do it, then it's very easy. That's like taking a vitamin, which is easily absorbed. It's already broken into the components. But we can learn even to take a general idea and figure out how to make a practice out of it. So you see that Swami Vivekananda was an expert at that. That one of the amazing things in the teachings of Swami Vivekananda is that you find a teaching that he gives, and then you trace it to a teaching in Sri Ramakrishna. And perhaps the teaching in Sri Ramakrishna was something very simple that you never noticed anything special about. And Swami Vivekananda could understand that, oh, this means this huge idea with all of these ramifications, all of these implications, all of these practical aspects, and so forth. That's why Swamiji, as Narendra, before he was Vivekananda, he said that any statement of the master, a book can be written on any statement of the master. And some of his fellow young devotees challenged him, and he said, okay, take any statement of the master. So they picked one which seemed like an innocent statement, and Narendra lectured on it for 2 days, drawing out the implications of that idea. So we, of course, can't expect to have that kind of power to assimilate so thoroughly that we can, it's like being able to take the energy in the atomic energy within a lump of matter. We may be able to take a piece of coal and burn it and get the energy that's available by fire in coal. But if we could take the nuclear energy within the coal, of course, then that would be huge, a vast amount of power. And so Swami Vivekananda had that power, but at least let us have the power of burning the coal and getting that much energy out of instruction. So the mind becoming quiet when the guru is giving instruction, and second, the ability to assimilate. And for assimilation, just as with listening, he gives the example of the snake. Listening to the charmer, the snake becomes quiet and attentive. But then here also he gives an example. He says that an image cannot be developed on a plain piece of glass. Now he's talking of photography in the 1880s and before, and for some time afterwards also, where to take a photograph, take a piece of a clear piece of glass and coat it with a silver solution. I forget the silver chemical, silver nitrate. Silver nitrate. They coat the glass with silver nitrate, and then through the lens, the light would be focused onto the lens, and it would react to the light, and you would get the image, the negative image. And so without the solution on the glass, without the silver nitrate, you just have glass. And so, yes, you put the clear piece of glass in the camera, you get an image on the glass because the glass is reflective. And so you get the image. But you take the glass out and the image is gone. And so the instruction of the teacher, it goes into the ear, but as soon as the person goes out of the room or the guru gets up and leaves, then the whatever was heard is lost. And so the ability to retain and to assimilate, like the ability that as it were, that the silver nitrate gives to the plate of glass. And then the third sign is the true devotee has controlled his senses. He has subdued his lust. The gopis were free from lust. And so, as we gain in devotion, we find that our interest in the senses begins to diminish. And that is a sign of growing devotion. It doesn't mean that you begin to feel devotion and everything disappears, all of your biological urges and all of that, that they disappear. No, but you begin to have less interest in those things. The mind finds that it's that tremendous fascination which the mind normally has, the tremendous attraction that the mind has, the tremendous expectation that the mind has of lasting pleasure. The mind begins to understand that's not there. So, yes, the urge may be there, but the drive is not what it used to be. And so then he continues, you are talking about your leading a householder's life. Suppose you are a householder. It rather helps in the practice of spiritual discipline. It is like fighting from inside a fort. The tantrics sometimes use a corpse in their religious rites. Now and then the dead body frightens them by opening its mouth. That is why they keep fried rice and grams near them. And from time to time they throw some of the grains into the corpse's mouth. Thus pacifying the corpse, they repeat the name of the deity without any worry. Likewise, the householder should pacify his wife and the other members of his family. He should provide them with food and other necessities. Thus, he removes the obstacles to his practice of spiritual discipline. So that's also a very beautiful instruction that you're talking about leading a householder's life. So what is the way for householders? How can we progress? So suppose you are a householder. It rather helps in spiritual life, in the practice of spiritual discipline, he says here. It's like fighting from within a fort. Now, that's something that Sri Ramakrishna says from time to time, but he often doesn't elaborate on it. Here, he doesn't elaborate much, but we begin to understand what he means by it's like fighting from within the fort. Again, not because he elaborates it, but because we can begin to see enough of what he's saying to elaborate on it ourselves. And so at first sight, it seems like a strange instruction that living within the household is like living within a fort. It seems like, going off to the forest and living in an ashram or in a cave or something, that's living within a fort, keeping the world away, and I'm staying safe within the fort and away from the world. Well, yes, that analogy also would be true to a point. But the point he's making here is that living in the household with a wife or with husband and family, because again, he was talking here to men. Everyone in the audience right now was a man, and so he's talking about living with one's wife and children. But if he were talking to women, it would be just the opposite, living with one's husband and children. So here he's talking from the standpoint of a more internal standpoint. That is, if you try to renounce the world prematurely, and this happens to many, you try to renounce the world prematurely, your desires are too strong. And suddenly you find yourself in a situation where, especially in India, here it's true of in the more traditional Catholic countries and so forth, where there was monasticism and priests were expected to be celibate. But in India, it's still true that if you are a sadhu and you're dressed like this, there are things that you just can't do, places you can't go. Even if you want to, you don't go because people will see that you as a sannyasi are going and you would lose all respect from society. And word would spread. And so there's certain things you're not allowed to do. So if you have desires and desires that are not controllable, then you find that eventually you're led to hypocrisy or something else. But if you live in the household, you have the opportunity to satisfy your desires and as you grow spiritually, to diminish that satisfaction. That is, as your interest begins to decrease, you don't feel interested in satisfying those desires as much. But it's still there if you need it, if the strong desire comes. Whereas if a person has renounced the world, they're on their own, and a strong desire comes, either they have to bear it, and if they're strong enough, that's what one should do as a monk, certainly, or one becomes hypocritical. And so living in the household, also living the life of a sadhu, a traditional sadhu, was not easy. You had to go without many things, and you couldn't cook a feast for yourself and make every time you felt like a rasagola, go to your kitchen and make a rasagola. You had to beg for your food, and the food you would get usually by begging was very coarse and rude, or very crude and coarse food. Again, by living in the household, you have the opportunity to satisfy some of your desires, so they're not just frustrated. But at the same time, as you grow and develop, you're able to diminish the expression of those desires. And so here he talks about it is like fighting from inside a fort. And then he expands on the idea by talking about the tantrikas. In certain tantric practice, the sadhaka, the aspirant, would sit on a corpse, a dead person's body. And that sounds strange. Here in America, if you wanted to sit on a corpse, where would you go to find one? You'd have to make your own, which you're not allowed to do and you shouldn't do. But in India, everything is available. Somehow or another, you can get everything. And so if you get a corpse, you sit on it for meditation. And he says something strange here, that once in a while, the mouth of the corpse would open. Now, I don't know, not being a physiologist or anatomist or a doctor or anything like that, nor having practiced this kind of tantric sadhana. I don't know if that was just a reflex action or action of the body as it's beginning to, the juices of the body are beginning to dry up and the muscles are beginning to contract, that's why the mouth opened. Or whether it was, as the belief was, it was something more psychic that was taking place. But anyway, he says that's why a tantrika keeps some lentils, some dal, some pulses, and some fried gram and some fried rice to drop into the mouth of the corpse just to keep it quiet, so that one could continue one's practice. And so he uses that as an analogy for one living in the household. That now and then you're living in the household, you have a spouse, husband or wife, and you have children. And so you have to feed the corpse. It may not be a very beautiful analogy, but it's an effective analogy. You have to feed it, you have to give something to it to keep it satisfied so you can go on doing your japa. So it's really a very effective analogy. Thus pacifying the corpse, they repeat the name of the deity without any worry. Likewise, the householder should pacify his wife or her husband and the other members of the family. He should provide them with food and other necessities. Thus he removes the obstacles to his practice of spiritual disciplines. Then he continues, those who still have a few worldly experiences to enjoy should lead a householder's life and pray to God. That is why Nityananda allowed the worldly to enjoy catfish soup and the warm embrace of a young woman while repeating God's name. So those who still have some desire for worldly experience, yes, then the married life is there. Why have societies around the world provided for marriage? Why don't men and women, you could avoid a lot of trouble and a lot of suffering if just when you wanted to, you go and join with a partner, and then you separate once you've satisfied your desire, and then much of the sufferings of life would be reduced. No, it's because societies have instituted in their various ways in different cultures, have instituted marriage and made it a sacred bond because if you do the other, if you just come together just for mating and then you disappear, and whenever you feel like mating, you just find somebody, then that is only feeding your animal desires without the consequent responsibility. But if you enter into the bond of marriage, then a responsibility comes with it, so that you have the understanding that the enjoyment for which I entered into this union comes with responsibility. That I have to care for this person, and this person has to care for me. If we have children, we have to care for the children, and so forth. And so it puts a limit on that desire for enjoyment. So it's not that whenever I have a desire, I just go find someone who has a similar desire, and then we're finished with it. No, it puts a strict limit, and it gives a strict amount of responsibility, so that you can grow through the institution of marriage. So that the institution of marriage helps us to elevate ourselves and to reduce the raging desires that we are naturally born with. So, but it is quite different with genuine sannyasis. A bee lights on flowers and on nothing else. To the chatak, all water except rain is tasteless. It will drink no other water, but looks up agape for the rain that falls when the star Swati is in the ascendant. It drinks only that water. A real sannyasi will not enjoy any kind of bliss except the bliss of God. The bee lights only on flowers. The real monk is like a bee, whereas the householder devotee is like a common fly, which lights on a festering sore as well as on a sweetmeat. That he's clarifying the idea, because the ideals have to be clarified. The ideal of a householder and the ideal of a sannyasi are not the same. Both should, neither has to, there's no law, but both should seek God. Should seek God. Why? For their own welfare, not because somebody wants you to. It's not like a parent telling their child who loves the arts that, well, no, you have to be an engineer because that's where the money is. You can't be an artist because then you'll live like a beggar. You have to be an engineer, but I don't want to be an engineer. Well, you have to be one. It's not should like that. It's should in the sense that it's for our welfare. So if you don't see God, then that's there's no one's punishment but karma's punishment, or the punishment of your own experience. So both the householder and the sannyasi, if they want to go towards the goal of life, the true goal of life, then they should cultivate love for God, aspiration for spiritual enlightenment. Because it's in their interest. It's not anyone else's interest. It's in their interest. So he's clarifying that if one chooses the ideal of the sannyasi, don't think that what he just said for householders, that goes for the sannyasi. No, it doesn't. For the sannyasi, there's a different standard. They have to stick to this standard. The householder, because they have chosen the path of the householder, they have the opportunity for enjoyment, which they can gradually lessen, and as their mind begins to go more towards God. But for the sannyasi, no, that's not allowed. This is another standard for the sannyasi. So he's clarifying the distinction. He continues, "You have taken so much trouble to come here. You must be seeking God. But almost everyone is satisfied simply by seeing the garden. Only one or two look for its owner. People enjoy the beauty of the world. They do not seek its owner." And so here he's saying that you, the people who had come to him at Dakshineshwar, people seated in front of him in his room at Dakshineshwar, that you have come here because you wanted to hear about God. There's so many things you could have done. You could have gone for some entertainment. You could have done all kinds of things instead of coming here, but you came here because you want to hear about God. And so he is recognizing the goodness of the people who had come and the sincerity of their desire. They wouldn't have come had they not had some sincerity. So he says, you must be seeking God because of that. But then he says that almost everyone is satisfied by merely seeing the garden. Very few seek the owner of the garden. That is, the analogy is meant to say that most of us are satisfied with this. We don't seek God, who is the reality behind this. So many Christian hymns, and some of them quite beautiful, both the music and sometimes the lyrics quite poetic. But many of them are directed towards expressing the beauty of this world. And so that's why Swami Vivekananda said that Christianity, not Christ, but Christianity as it had developed as a popular religion, was a religion of, what was it, sex, love, and I forget what it was, love of sex, love, and the world or something. I forget what the other thing was, qualifier that he used. That is that people want this world, and they praise God for having made such a beautiful world for them. No, seek God because God is beauty itself. I have to say that some analogies speak to some people, and some analogies don't speak to the same person, even a spiritual aspirant. And I'll explain what I mean. That is, you may read the gospel, read the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, and some analogies and some stories and some metaphors he uses may be very apt. You may find them very apt, and others you may not like. That's okay, because we come to a text with our own understanding. And I say that because this is an example which I never liked. Now I understand it more deeply and I appreciate it. But what I didn't like about it was, or the reason it didn't appeal to me, I should say, it wasn't that, oh, I don't like that, not like that, but just that it didn't speak to me, was because the analogy itself, the meaning behind it I understood, and that I appreciated, but the analogy didn't ring true to me. Because if I go to see a beautiful garden, say, forget about the spiritual meaning, just the analogy itself, what's being used for the example. If I go to a beautiful garden, I couldn't care less about going to meet the gardener. I would be bored to go meet the gardener, unless I could learn something from him or her. But otherwise, if I go to the botanical garden or something, I go there because I want to see the beauty of the garden. So who cares about the gardener? So the analogy never appealed to me for that reason. But of course, the purpose of the analogy was something else, and that I appreciate. And now I can forget about my own personal relationship to the analogy and just attend to the meaning. So I give this example just to illustrate the fact that many of you may find sometimes a spiritual example which doesn't appeal to you at all. Well, that's okay, because we all understand an example from our own standpoint. Like we had a devotee who's now passed away, a devotee at Ridgely Manor, a very fine woman, who was a very close devotee. But whenever the example, whether in the Gita or in other texts, would come up of spiritual warfare, it would drive her crazy. She said she hated the image of warfare and battles, that was something that was so crude and so violent and so aggressive, and everything that she hated about society was tied up in the armaments industry and the military industrial complex and the aggression of men, the typical historical aggression of men, and the desire, the bloodlust and fighting and all of that. So anything that spoke in terms of spiritual warfare or the battlefield of this life or anything like that, it would immediately turn her off. And she would begin to hyperventilate. She would get so upset with the example. So again, this is a long tangent, but it's never come up for me before. I was reminded of it by this example, so I wanted to make a point of it. That when we approach a text, that's why some texts will appeal to us and others won't appeal to us. For instance, with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, for some people that is their very favorite text above all other texts. And other people, good devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, I'm not talking about somebody who's unconnected or uninterested, but some good devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, some good monastics of the order of Ramakrishna, they are not attracted to the gospel at all. They're attracted to something else, maybe the great master or to the teachings of Swami Vivekananda or whatever. So find that in spiritual life which speaks to you. Don't beat your head against that which irritates you. There's no need for that. There's plenty in the realm of spirituality which will speak to you, that you can go to that rather than thinking, why do they say that? And always being bothered by the thing that you don't like. Well, forget about that. Go to something that you do like. Because if there's something we find in spiritual instruction that we don't like, we may not for a long time understand what it is that's causing me to dislike it. It's only with the further growth that we find what it was that we dislike. And so just let it go. Again, with this personal example of mine, for a long time I didn't know why I was so bothered by this example. It wasn't that it was obsessive, that I thought about it all the time, but just when I would read it or hear it, then I thought, I don't like that. I realized it's because I would never go, and I still wouldn't go, to a garden to see the gardener. I don't care about the gardener. I love gardens. So again, that's a long tangent, but maybe it has some use to someone. So pointing to the singer, Sri Ramakrishna pointing to the singer. A little while ago, he sang a song describing the 6 centers. These are dealt with in yoga. There are 2 kinds of yoga, Hatha yoga and Raja yoga. The Hatha yogi practices physical exercises. His goal is to acquire supernatural powers, longevity, and the 8 psychic powers. These are his aims. But the aim of Raja Yoga is the attainment of devotion, ecstatic love, knowledge, and renunciation. Of these 2, Raja Yoga is the better. And of course, as Sri Ramakrishna knew, there are people who follow both. Hatha Yoga to develop the strength of the body to sustain the higher practices of Raja Yoga. So they practice the 2 together. But here he's speaking of them as separate disciplines, which is the way many people practice them. So if you read something like the Gheranda Samhita or Hatha Yoga Pradipika, you find that though it speaks of meditation and samadhi, everything is from the standpoint of the physical exercises and the pranayama, etc., and the attainment of the vibhutis, the psychic powers, and so forth. So just a note to those who are not from India, at the beginning of the paragraph, it says, pointing to the singer. Well, Sri Ramakrishna being a traditional Indian, that doesn't mean that he said like that, pointing to the singer, that in India is considered very impolite to point at somebody. So he indicated like this or something, but indicated not that means that Americans should stop pointing because it's impolite. No, each culture has its language of etiquette, where things mean certain things in that culture. And so just as in a certain language, there's certain words that in a particular language, it may be a very bad word. And in another language, they have a word that sounds just the same, which is a very good word. And so you are careful not to use the wrong word in the wrong language because of the different meanings of words in different languages. And so in etiquette also, There is the etiquette of Western countries, and even that differs from country to country. I remember as a teenager when I was getting ready to go to Sweden as an exchange student. I'd never been out of the United States, had hardly traveled within the United States. I had never been beyond North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. I'd never been, well, no, once I'd been up to Massachusetts and through the states going to Massachusetts, but just once driving up and driving back with my father, or riding up with my father. So I traveled very little. But the son of the family I was to live with in Sweden, he came first to stay with my parents. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, I went to stay with his parents for 12 months. And so one of the first things we noticed, me and the other members of my family, was that when he would say hello, he would click his heels. It was very nice to see. It was something quite different from us. So when he would meet my father or something, he would very formally nod and put out his hand and click his heels. So again, that was something that if you do here, people think it's somewhat strange here in America, but it was what was done in Sweden, and a very nice gesture, but not part of the language of etiquette here. And so India, of course, being a very different culture, there are many things that are done and definitely not done there that are just the opposite here. So again, pointing doesn't mean like that. This is called the tarjani, the finger. Each finger has a name, as we have the index finger, but in India it's the tarjani, and that's the scolding finger. And so to point at somebody is very impolite. It's an aggressive gesture. So anyway, Sri Ramakrishna points to the singer and mentions that he sang a little while ago a song to the 6 centers of consciousness, starting from the Muladhara at the base of the spine, Swadhisthana, Manipura, Anahata, etc., up to the top of the head. One thing to note causes a lot of confusion. Sri Ramakrishna here and texts also, traditional texts, speak of the 6 centers of consciousness. But then there are the 7 lotuses, the Sahasrara being the 7th. That's because only the first 6 are considered levels of consciousness. Here is where, on the 7th, is where you attain to realization. And so it's not counted because it's beyond the 6 centers, even though it forms the 7th in the map of the Kundalini. It's still spoken of the 6 centers of consciousness, which are still locatable within the body. But when one comes here, then body consciousness itself is completely gone. So he says that there are 2 types of yoga. There's Hatha Yoga and there's Raja Yoga. Let me read a little bit more. There is much similarity between the 7 planes described in the Vedanta and the 6 centers of yoga. And again, it's the 6 centers plus the 7th. The first 3 planes of the Vedas may be compared to the first 3 yogic centers, namely Muladhara, Swadhisthana, and Manipura. With ordinary people, the mind dwells in these 3 planes, at the organs of evacuation and generation and at the navel. When the mind ascends to the 4th plane, the center designated in yoga as anahata, it sees the individual soul as a flame. Besides, it sees light. At this, the aspirant cries, "Ah, what is this? Ah, what is this?" So here, most people dwell within the 3 lower centers. The centers that correspond to, in the physical body, the lowest Muladhara near the organ of evacuation, the next higher Swadhisthana at the level of the generative organ, and the Manipura at the level of the navel. And so this is where our social life, our ordinary life is lived, with the mind in these 3 planes. So no, it doesn't mean that we feel our mind in those 3 planes. It means that when the vital energy is mainly restricted to these 3 planes, then this is the experience we have. and eating and sleeping and procreating and enjoying the world and so forth. Uh, and so that he's saying that the 6 centers plus the 7th, there's a correspondence between those and the 7 planes of the Vedas. So Bhur Bhuva Swa, those correspond to the lower 3 centers. And so when this is Bhuloka, this world is called Bhuloka, the basic world. And then if we're basically good people and we die, but not spiritual, but basically good people, then we go to Chandraloka, Bhuvaloka, the second level, where we have sort of a long family reunion with the ancestors, and then we come back to earth again. And if we are very generous, again, not spiritually awakened, but generous and even better people, then we may go to Swaraloka, to the realm of the lower deities. Those who are more like angelic beings, the lower deities who are supervisors over cosmic functions. And so we go there and enjoy, but it's a realm of enjoyment. And so those 3 realms are the realms in which we ordinary people live. In this world and the 2 higher worlds, where all of the 3 together are worlds of enjoyment. The 2 higher worlds, the realm of the ancestors and the realm of the lower deities, there's more enjoyment and less suffering. Here in this world, joy and sorrow are somewhat evenly mixed. Pain and pleasure are somewhat evenly mixed. But then we come to the anahata, the level of the heart. When the consciousness rises to this level, then one sees the flame of the soul. And one sees a divine light within the heart. And as he says, one cries, "Ah, what is this? What is this?" Because the light which one sees at the heart is unlike anything one has ever seen before. We've known all kinds of physical light, the light of the sun, the light of the moon, the light of the stars. Now you can go to Home Depot or Lowe's or to your local hardware store or elsewhere and buy different types of light bulbs that give natural light, that give yellowish light, which give soft light, etc. And so there's all kinds of light that we're used to here at this level, but all of it is physical light. We're also used to mental light. That is, when I close my eyes and I visualize something, it may, if I'm not good at visualizing, it may be very hazy, and it's kind of like I almost see it and I almost don't see it. I'm not sure which it is, but I can imagine light. I can imagine a light in my heart. But that is mental light, mentally produced light. That also is known to us. And so seeing that is not a new experience. But when this light of consciousness awakens in the heart, then that's a mysterious light, the likes of which we have never perceived before. And so that's why we say, "Ah, what is this? What is this?" Something wonderful, something mysterious, something beautiful that awakened, something unseen before and unimagined before. And then he goes on, when the mind rises to the 5th plane at the throat, the Vishuddha, the aspirant wants to hear only about God. This is the Vishuddha center of yoga. The 6th plane and the center known by the yogis as Ajna are one and the same. When the mind rises there, the aspirant sees God, but still there is a barrier between God and the devotee. Devotee on this side, God on that side. It is like the barrier of glass in a lantern, which keeps one from touching the light. King Janaka used to give instruction about Brahmajnana from the 5th plane. Sometimes he dwelt on the 5th plane and sometimes on the 6th. Swami Turiyananda used to say that the Holy Mother's mind would never go below the 5th chakra, the center in the throat. And when one's mind is there, one hardly has any body consciousness. The consciousness of the body practically does, even though you're aware of the world, you see the world, you can talk to people and so forth. But it's a very strange thing that the consciousness of the body, the awareness of the body has practically disappeared. You hear about Purna, the disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, who was the only one of Sri Ramakrishna's six Ishvara Kotis, that is the closest disciples to him, who was a householder. He was married, he had children, but it said that he had no body consciousness below his head. He had no body consciousness. So he lived the life of a householder, went through his daily duties and did everything, but he had no consciousness of the body below his head. And so these are states which are very strange to us. We can't even imagine how one would operate in such a state. But these are truths. And so and then the higher state. So Holy Mother's mind never went below here. That doesn't mean that it never went above here either. No, but this was the lowest it came. And in her ordinary dealings, this is where her mind was. So that's a very high state that she never went below. And so finally, I'll stop here, even though there's not much left in the paragraph, but I don't like to rush through things. After passing the 6 centers, the aspirant arrives at the 7th plane. Reaching it, the mind merges in Brahman. The individual soul and the supreme soul become one. The aspirant goes into samadhi. His consciousness of the body disappears. He loses the knowledge of the outer world. He does not see the manifold anymore. His reasoning comes to a stop. So when one comes here, when the mind comes here, then one is merged in Brahman. Then not only does the body consciousness below the head disappear, even the awareness of the head, the awareness of the eyes, the ears, the world which is seen, the world which is heard, all of that disappears. There's nothing left of the world, nothing left of the body, nothing left of individuality. Just the vast ocean of infinity, which is indescribable. And completely transcendent over our present experience. So there's no way we can imagine it, no way we can think about it, because it's outside of the mind. No matter how hard we try to imagine what it would be like, it's fruitless, because the mind is spatial and temporal by nature. We can only think of things in space and within time. And where there is no time, no space, it's inconceivable by the mind. Where there's no causation, it's inconceivable by the mind. Where there's no conception, no thinking, no words, of course it's inconceivable by the mind. So there, when one reaches here, then all of relativity disappears utterly. And there's just the ocean of Brahman. But even ocean of Brahman is just a figure of speech. It's not that you see an ocean. We only say the ocean of Brahman because an ocean is the closest thing in our experience to it, or sometimes with the vast sky of Brahman. That is the idea of vastness and formlessness. So, but even those are just images. It's not what it's really like. So we'll stop here, and next time we will finish the day and then continue with the next day. So now let me give announcements, and then if there are any questions, I will answer those. So for announcements, on Sunday, I will speak in the series on basic concepts of Vedanta. I'll speak on Brahman, what Brahman is, and the development of the idea of Brahman and what Brahman refers to, and what it means for us spiritually. And then next week, on Tuesday, we'll have the Gita class at the usual time, 7:30 in the evening, live streamed. But next Thursday, there will be no gospel class. This class will not occur next Thursday because it's Thanksgiving. We'll have the Sunday service after that, and then the classes will continue. But next Thursday, there will be no class. All of the classes will be maintained. So are there no questions? So I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha.